Before Europe learned the faith, Africa carried the flame.
Before you call your pastor, sit down and give me 11 seconds. Christianity didn't start in Rome, didn't start in Europe, and didn't start with white missionaries in pith helmets. Christianity started in Africa. The Coptic Orthodox Church of Egypt was founded by the Apostle Mark in Alexandria in 42 AD, almost 2,000 years ago, while Europe was still worshiping Jupiter and Thor. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church was established when King Ethiopian of Aksum converted around 330 AD, making Ethiopia the second nation on earth to adopt Christianity as a state religion, ahead of the Roman Empire, which didn't fully convert under Theodosius until 380 AD. The first Christian monastery in the world was built by St. Anthony in the Egyptian desert around 270 AD. Three of the most important early church fathers, Augustine of Hippo, born 354 AD in modern Algeria, Tertullian, born around 155 AD in Carthage in modern Tunisia, and Athanasius of Alexandria, born around 296 AD in Egypt, were all African. The faith you were told came from Europe was built by African hands centuries before Europe could spell the word theology. Stay with me, because the dates are documented, the buildings are still standing, and the erasure has receipts. Open the book of Acts and read chapter 2, verses 9 through 11. When the Holy Spirit fell at Pentecost around 33 AD, the crowd in Jerusalem included people from Egypt and the parts of Libya about Cyrene. Africans were in that upper room. Africans heard the first sermon. Africans took the gospel home with them. Acts chapter 8, verses 26 through 39 tells the story of the Ethiopian eunuch, a treasurer of Queen Candace of the Kingdom of Meroe in what is now Sudan, who was baptized by the Apostle Philip on a road outside Jerusalem and carried the faith back to Africa, probably before any apostle had set foot in Rome. That Ethiopian official is the first recorded Gentile convert to Christianity in the Bible. Not a European, an African. Riding home in a chariot with a scroll of Isaiah on his lap and the Holy Spirit on his shoulder. The faith went south before it went west. Now walk into Alexandria in 42 AD, because this is where the institution was born. Mark, the same Mark who wrote the second gospel, traveled to Alexandria according to early church historian Eusebius and founded the Christian community there. Alexandria at that time was the intellectual capital of the ancient world, home to the great library of Alexandria, a melting pot of Egyptian, Greek, Jewish, and African thought. The Coptic Church grew out of that soil. By 190 AD, the Catechetical School of Alexandria, led by a scholar named Pantaenus, was the most important theological academy in the Christian world. After him came Clement of Alexandria around 200 AD, then Origen around 215 AD, who produced more biblical commentary, philosophical theology, and textual criticism than any thinker of his era. Origen wrote the Hexapla, a 6-column comparison of Old Testament texts in different languages, around 240 AD. The serious study of Christian theology was invented in Africa by Africans more than 1,000 years before any European university existed. Sit with the Desert Fathers, because this is where Christian monasticism was born. Saint Anthony, an Egyptian Copt born around 251 AD in Coma, Egypt, sold his inheritance, walked into the desert, and lived as a hermit for over 80 years. His example sparked the entire monastic movement. By the 300s, thousands of Egyptian and Sudanese Christians had moved into the deserts of Wadi Natron, Cetus, and the Thebaid to live in caves, cells, and communal monasteries. Pachomius the Egyptian founded the first communal monastery around 320 AD at Tabernes in Upper Egypt, and wrote the first monastic rule, the template every later monastery, including the famous European Benedictine houses, will follow. When you picture monks praying in cells, copying manuscripts, growing food in walled gardens, that whole structure was invented in Africa by Africans. European monasticism is an African export. Now zoom into Ethiopia, because the story over there ran independent and unbroken from the start. King Ezana of Aksum, ruling from about 320 AD to 360 AD, converted to Christianity through the teaching of Frumentius, a Syrian Christian shipwrecked on the Eritrean coast as a boy, who was later consecrated as the first bishop of Aksum by Athanasius of Alexandria around 328 AD. Ezana minted coins with the cross on them, making Aksum one of the earliest states to use Christian symbols on official currency. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church developed its own scriptures in Ge'ez, including books like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees that mainstream European Christianity later dropped from its Bible, but Ethiopia preserved intact. The Ethiopian biblical canon includes 81 books, more than any other Christian tradition, because Ethiopia kept the early African Christian library when Rome started trimming it. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved straight down into the bedrock between the 12th and 13th centuries under King Lalibela, are 11 medieval cathedrals chiseled out of single blocks of volcanic stone with no European blueprint and no European supervision. Africans built a stone Jerusalem in the highlands while Europe was still figuring out how to mortar a wall. Pause on the African church fathers, because these are the men who literally wrote Christian doctrine. Tertullian of Carthage, born around 155 AD in what is now Tunisia, is called the father of Latin Christianity. He coined the Latin word Trinitas, Trinity, which is how the doctrine of three persons in one God came to be expressed in every Western church for the next 1800 years. He also coined the words sacrament, person in the theological sense, and substance. Without Tertullian's African mind, Western Christian theology doesn't have a vocabulary. Cyprian of Carthage, born around 200 AD, also African, became Bishop of Carthage and wrote foundational works on the unity of the church and the role of bishops, shaping Catholic ecclesiology forever. Augustine of Hippo, born 354 AD in Thagaste in modern Algeria to a Berber mother named Monica, became the single most influential theologian in Western Christian history. His books, especially the Confessions written around 397 AD and the City of God completed around 426 AD, shaped Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, and Reformed theology so deeply that every seminary on earth still requires students to read him. He was African. His mother was African. His skin was the color of North African Berber people, which is to say brown, sun-darkened, and not even close to the pale European saint your stained glass window shows you. Now look at the popes, because this is the part that breaks Catholic textbooks. The Roman Catholic Church has had at least 3 African popes in its history. Pope Victor I, born in the Roman province of Africa, served as pope from around 189 to 199 AD. He standardized the date of Easter and shifted the official language of the Roman Church from Greek to Latin. Pope Miltiades, also African, served from 311 to 314 AD and presided during the legalization of Christianity under Emperor Constantine. Pope Gelasius I, born in Africa, served from 492 to 496 AD and articulated the doctrine of the 2 powers, the separation of spiritual and secular authority. That shaped European political theology for the next 1,000 years. 3 African popes, 3 men of the African continent sitting on the chair of St. Peter, making decisions that shaped the entire Western Church before it had ever heard the name of Charlemagne. You weren't taught their names. That wasn't an accident. Sit with the gospel manuscripts, because the oldest physical copies of the New Testament come from Africa. The Codex Sinaiticus, dated to around 330 to 360 AD, is one of the 2 oldest complete Bibles in existence, written in Greek on parchment and preserved at St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai Desert until parts of it were taken to Europe in the 1800s. The Codex Vaticanus, of similar age, came from the Egyptian textual tradition. The Bodmer papyri, discovered in Egypt in the 1950s, include Greek copies of the Gospel of John and other texts dating from around 200 AD, some of the earliest substantial New Testament manuscripts ever found. The Oxyrhynchus papyri, dug up from a trash mound at the Egyptian town of Oxyrhynchus, contain thousands of fragments of biblical and early Christian texts. The reason you can read a Bible in English today is because African Christians in Egypt and Sudan copied, preserved, and protected those manuscripts for centuries before Europe ever cared about textual accuracy. The oldest Christian art, the oldest Christian liturgy, the oldest Christian monastic rule, the oldest complete biblical manuscripts, the oldest theological academy, the oldest African saints, the oldest unbroken Christian state. Africa, 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 Africa. Now, look at the early martyrs, because the blood of African Christians built the church. Perpetua and Felicity were killed in the arena in Carthage in 203 AD. Perpetua was a young noblewoman. Felicity was an enslaved woman, both African, both pregnant or recently delivered. Both refused to renounce their faith. Their prison diary, The Passion of Perpetua and Felicity, is one of the earliest Christian texts written by a woman in history. Their names are still read in Catholic and Orthodox liturgies around the world. Cyprian was beheaded in Carthage in 258 AD. Catherine of Alexandria, an Egyptian Christian noblewoman, was tortured and killed around 305 AD for refusing to renounce Christ. Mark himself was reportedly dragged through the streets of Alexandria and killed around 68 AD by a mob hostile to the new faith. The early Christian church didn't just begin in Africa, it bled in Africa. The arenas of Carthage and the streets of Alexandria soaked up the blood of believers whose names are still spoken in churches that don't even know they're quoting Africans. Now feel the rage point at the right target, because the erasure is documented and the motive is plain. When European powers colonized Africa starting in the 15th century, and accelerating through the 19th and 20th centuries. They arrived with missionaries who told African people that Christianity was a European religion they were generously bringing as a gift. That lie was strategic. It justified colonialism as a civilizing mission. It positioned Africans as recipients rather than originators of the faith. It cut black Christians off from the history that would have told them their ancestors built the foundation of the religion the colonizers claimed to own. The European missionaries who walked into Lagos and Kinshasa and Cape Town in the 1800s telling Africans about Jesus were preaching a faith their own ancestors learned from Africans 1,500 years earlier and forgot to credit. The theft was complete enough that today, when you tell a black Christian in America that Christianity is African, they look at you like you're making it up. That confusion is the finished product of a centuries-long marketing campaign. Look at the architecture of that erasure, because the strategies are still visible. European Christian art systematically whitened every African figure. St. Augustine got painted pale. St. Anthony got painted pale. Mary got painted pale. Jesus got painted pale. The Coptic and Ethiopian icons that preserved the original brown-skinned imagery were dismissed as primitive or schismatic by European church authorities. Coptic and Ethiopian Christians, who had been Christian longer than any European, got treated as deviants from the true faith by Catholic and Protestant missionaries who knew nothing about church history before the year 1000. The theological textbooks taught in American seminaries until very recently mentioned Augustine without mentioning he was North African Berber. They mentioned Tertullian without mentioning he was Carthaginian. They named the early ecumenical councils without saying that the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD was attended by hundreds of African bishops, and that the entire Christological controversy of the next 200 years was driven by debates between African theologians in Alexandria and Asian theologians in Antioch and Constantinople. European Christianity didn't shape those debates. European Christianity inherited them. Walk into the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD because this is the moment Europeans like to claim and the moment African receipts make impossible to claim. Emperor Constantine called the council to settle the dispute over the nature of Christ. The central figure of Orthodox Christianity at that council was Athanasius of Alexandria, an Egyptian who fought against the Arian heresy and successfully argued that Jesus Christ was of the same substance as God the Father. The Nicene Creed, recited every Sunday in Catholic, Orthodox, Anglican, and Lutheran churches around the world to this day, was hammered out by African and Middle Eastern bishops with minimal European participation. The doctrine of the Trinity that every Christian on earth professes was systematized by Athanasius of Alexandria and the Cappadocian Fathers in the 4th century, with Athanasius leading the African contingent. When you stand in church and recite, "I believe in one God, the Father Almighty," you are reciting a creed written largely by Africans against the European Aryans who tried to water it down. Sit with the Nag Hammadi library because this is the kind of receipt nobody can ignore. In December 1945, an Egyptian farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman, digging for fertilizer near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, found a sealed clay jar containing 13 leather-bound codices full of Coptic Christian writings dating to around 350 AD. Inside were Gospels, treatises, and theological texts, including the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, and the Apocryphon of John. These texts had been preserved by African Christian monks in the Egyptian desert for 1,600 years before a farmer accidentally rediscovered them. Whether you consider those texts canonical or not is beside the point. The point is that the most diverse and theologically rich early Christian library in existence was preserved in Africa by African Christians, while Europe was just starting to figure out that Jesus wasn't a Roman emperor. Look at the Ethiopian connection to the Ark of the Covenant, because this is where the story gets even bigger. Ethiopian tradition, recorded in the Kebra Nagash, the Glory of the Kings, compiled around the 14th century, but drawing on much older sources, holds that Menelik I, the son of King Solomon of Israel and Queen Makeda of Sheba, brought the Ark of the Covenant from Jerusalem to Aksum around 950 BC. The Ark, according to Ethiopian belief, has rested in the chapel of the tablet at the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum for nearly 3,000 years, guarded by a single monk who lives his entire life on the grounds and is never allowed to leave. Whether you accept the literal claim or not, the tradition itself tells you something. Ethiopia has held itself as a nation in covenant with the biblical God since before Jerusalem fell to Babylon. The Ethiopian Christian identity stretches back into the Old Testament and forward through the New, with no interruption, no missionary middleman, no European intervention. They never needed white missionaries because they were Christian before most of Europe knew Jesus existed. Now bring this into your house, because abstract history doesn't change anything until it changes how you live. The next time somebody tells you Christianity is the white man's religion, you have an entire continent of receipts to throw on the table. The next time you see a painting of St. Augustine looking like a Norwegian, repaint him in your mind as the brown North African Berber he was, raised by a mother named Monica, who spoke the local language and probably wore traditional African dress before she converted. The next time you read about the Council of Nicaea, picture a room full of brown-skinned bishops from Egypt, Libya, and Carthage, debating Greek philosophy with their Syrian and Greek colleagues, while European delegates sat in the corner taking notes. The next time you hear someone praise the Desert Fathers without naming their continent, supply the missing word. African. The next time a pastor preaches about monasticism, Trinitarian theology, or the early creeds without crediting Africa, write the names down and bring them up after service. Teach the kids the names. Mark in Alexandria, 42 AD. Anthony in the Egyptian desert, 270 AD. Athanasius of Alexandria, 296 AD. Augustine of Hippo, 354 AD. Tertullian of Carthage, 155 AD. Cyprian of Carthage, 200 AD. Perpetua and Felicity, 203 AD. Pope Victor I, 189 AD. Pope Miltiades, 311 AD. Pope Gelasius I, 492 AD. King Ezna of Aksum, 330 AD. King Lalibela, 12th century. The Ethiopian eunuch, 30s AD. Frumentius, 4th century. Pachomius, 320 AD. Make those names familiar in your house the way the European saints used to be. Print their icons. Hang them up. Light candles for them on their feast days. They earned their place. The world tried to write them out. Your home is the place where they walk back in. Walk past the steeple and walk into the bigger truth. The faith that millions of Black Americans hold dear. The faith that built Black churches, sustained Black families through slavery and Jim Crow. The faith that produced the spirituals and the gospel music and the civil rights movement was always a homecoming. Black Christianity in America isn't a borrowed religion. It's a returning religion. The ancestors who showed up on these shores in chains were brought to a faith their own great-great-grandparents had helped build 1,000 years earlier in Egypt, in Ethiopia, in Carthage, in Alexandria. The chain of African Christian witness was never broken on the continent. The Coptic and Ethiopian Orthodox churches have prayed without interruption for nearly 2,000 years. The chain in America had to be remade out of fragments because the slavers preferred their captives unaware of their own theological lineage. But the chain is being relinked now by historians, by genealogists, by Black scholars, by African elders teaching the diaspora what their ancestors built. You are part of that relink. Drop a comment with the name from this video you'd never heard before. Tell me what church tradition you grew up in and what they taught you about church history. Tell me if you're part of a Coptic or Ethiopian community, or if today is the first time you heard Christianity called African. Tag a pastor who needs to read this, and tell me which African Christian figure you want me to break down in detail next. Augustine and his African mother, Monica, the full story of Athanasius and the fight for the Trinity, the Ethiopian Ark of the Covenant, the Nag Hammadi Gospels, the 3 African popes, St. Anthony and the desert monks. Pick one and I'll bring the receipts the same way.